You're on mute.
And we are recording.
Well, my Teams was just not being a team player today. It was, for some reason, it has a way of playing tricks on me. But I'm here, and let's go ahead and get started. I'll call our meeting to order. And Guthrie, would you please take the roll?
Yes. Sandy Rowe. Terry Cross.
Here.
Greg Hammond.
Here.
Emily Simnett.
Present.
Richard Devlin.
Present.
Vanessa Becker. Arnell Fajardo. Rukaya Adams.
Present.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We have several items on our subcommittee agenda today. We have an action to take on an e-board request. It's important in the southern part of our state. We'll come back to that. We're going to be looking at our tuition review process, and so I think Jim Pinkert's going to be with us to discuss that. And also Jim and Donna will help us again look at our community college support fund. So we should be able to get through our agenda in a couple of hours. Our first action item is to approve minutes from June 8th and from October 12th. We just an oversight in not getting the June 8th minutes approved, having to do with turnover in staff, and thank you, Guthrie, for making sure that we're doing our work properly. So if there's no questions, I'll call for a motion to approve the June 8th minutes. Emily, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question. I wasn't on the committee or on the commission at all in June. Do I need to abstain from voting on minutes before I was on the commission?
Yeah, it would be appropriate for you to abstain, I think, so that would be fine. Is there anyone who would offer a motion to approve the June 8th minutes? Commissioner Devlin moves, and Commissioner Hammond seconds. So I think I got that right. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions?
Abstain.
Motion carries. So and we need to do the same with the October minutes. Is there a motion to approve the October? Anything or any comments or questions about them before I call for that motion? Commissioner Devlin, you looked like you were going to ask a question.
Actually, it's on the next item, but
okay.
I'll just move the minutes.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Devlin. And a second.
Yeah, I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Great. Been moved and seconded. All in favor of approving the minutes signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Any abstentions? Motion carries. As a friend of mine says, we're not afraid to make the tough decisions here. So, all right. So the next item on our agenda is public comment. And we remind people that if they when you want to sign up for comment, that they can do that through Guthrie Stafford at guthrie.stafford@hec.org.gov. Is that correct, Guthrie?
That is correct.
And do we have anyone signed up today?
We do not have anyone signed up for today's public comments.
Then moving right along, then our first action item is an e-board request from Klamath Community College on a well drilling program. And Commissioner Devlin, is this the one you had a question on?
Actually, yes. There's actually two items like this. There's the underlying approval of the program, which is a later item,
Yeah.
I believe. And then this item. And while I'm supportive of this item, I'm just wondering how this would all play out. If you're graduating new students, let's say with this background, and for the school to have the equipment necessary, it's about $900,000. Are they expecting that these new students are going to find employment with other drillers? Because it seems like, I'm not saying that you would need whatever the school is actually acquiring to teach this program, but it would look to me like there would be a big entry capital requirement to actually work in this area. And with a potential annual income of about $60,000, I don't see you being able to finance that.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to your question. We'll hear from Tom Reel about the request. I understand that this is an e-board request, so it's a request for funding, and that it's being brought to our attention because of a crisis in the region around Klamath Falls with regard to wells going dry. So, and not enough people trained to be able to drill those. So Tom, can you take it away, or is it, yeah, I think you're the presenter.
Thank you. Chair Cross, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Tom Reel, Director of Operations for the HECC, and I'm bringing this docket item to you to consider endorsing it to be brought to the full commission. Since it is a significant budget request, it needs the commission's approval for us to submit it to the December e-board. The request is for $975,000 for Klamath Community College to implement a well driller's curriculum. The majority of the funds, $950,000, will be used for a well drilling rig. The drought in Southern Oregon has affected the water tables throughout the area, and many homeowners have either underperforming or completely dry wells. There is a shortage of licensed well drillers in Oregon, and the data suggests it is a growing field. The program curriculum was recently approved by HECC staff as a 2-year non-credit training program. And this funding request has the support of Klamath County Board of Commissioners, the Oregon Water Resources Department, and the local work board, East Cascades Work. HECC staff has evaluated this request and feels it is a good example of how community colleges can support the workforce needs of the areas they serve. HECC staff recommends endorsement to go to the full committee. And Commissioner Devlin, in your answer, I believe the well drillers are going to be looking to get jobs at local other people with existing rigs. The rig will also be used on real life wells. Those schools get to partner with some local companies. But it'll be also used for training, but it's also to meet an immediate need. But yeah, you're right. There is a high cost of entry to own a well drilling business.
Yeah, I'm supportive of the request. I just, your answer is, sufficient if there are, other firms out there that are going to be hiring these people. Of course, they may not be hiring them in Klamath County too. So that's the issue, but I think it's worthwhile. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Any other questions or comments about this request? I see Greg's hand up. Commissioner Heyman?
Yeah. Tom, you mentioned that that there aren't enough, I don't know if you use the word certified or qualified. Does this, like perhaps a welding program, is there an external certifying entity, and does this curriculum meet that qualification?
Yes, it's the Oregon Water Resources Board actually does the certification, and they just increased their hours. So the students will have to become employed with a well driller to get the licensure. But this curriculum is taking that into consideration. So once they go through the program, they should, part of that program should be the employment with the partnered well drillers, and they'll end up with as a licensed well rigger.
Thank you.
Right. Any other questions about the e-board? And this is, we're making a recommendation to the full commission at our meeting tomorrow.
Mr. Chair, this is Ben, just
Yes.
especially for newer members, I'll clarify because this is maybe the first time that since several of you have joined that the subcommittee has taken action. It won't be the last time because we have other items coming before it. But typically when the subcommittee acts, it does so as a recommendation to the full commission under the HECC statutes and bylaws. Just about all action and really all formal action by the commission has to be undertaken by the full commission. So the subcommittee is not empowered to act on its own. So this is the form of most motions that come before this subcommittee. Minute approval is an exception, and there are some other sort of occasional exceptions, but formal action on the part of the commission has to be taken by the full commission, meaning your motion is a recommendation to the full commission. And we'll hear it again tomorrow, but with less time dedicated to it.
And Commissioner Hayman, I see your hands up. Has that
Oh,
left from?
Yeah, I did have, thank you, Chair Cross. I did have one more question. Maybe Director Cannon can answer this. Is there a sense of whether or not, I guess I have not a concern, but at least an interest in the e-board has a limited amount of resources available to it, and there's some sense in which they would assume that different agencies have some sort of sense of prioritization and what kinds of requests they would bring forward. And so I'm just wondering, do we have any sense of what other requests might be pending, and do we have any input from an organization like OCCA with regards to their support or interest in this specific request?
Yeah, I'll just note, and Tom should feel free to chime in here too. I don't have a good sense of the totality of potential e-board requests, but you're right that it is certainly possible that that the e-board would need to weigh this against other requests that taken together add up to more than what the e-board has the funds to expend or is in kind of the mood to spend. So I don't know in that sort of larger sense. I do know that we are behind the scenes at the staff level working on criteria for your consideration to guide the HECC in subsequent consideration of future consideration of emergency board requests, significant emergency board requests like this one, because while the staff is very supportive of this request, we recognize that if we were simply to say in advance of every e-board meeting, hey, colleges and universities, what funding needs do you have? It's quite likely that we would hear a lot of need, right? And if that's the case, we'll need some, especially if that's the case, we need some relatively stable set of criteria to weigh and evaluate those, and perhaps to signal to colleges and universities that there are only certain types of requests that really do qualify or should qualify as emergency board requests, and that the commission would be likely to advance. The Legislative Fiscal Office, on behalf of the Legislative Emergency Board, does create some very general criteria. Essentially that it's an emergency, or there's some other kind of qualifying circumstances, and so we're looking at those and sort of attempting to translate them into draft criteria that you could endorse in order to guide our partners in what does or does not constitute a kind of valid and likely to be HECC prioritized emergency board request.
Great. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts or comments? Yeah. Oh, you're on.
Oh,
I'm not hearing.
I just wanted to draw folks' attention to my comment about I neglected to say that while we didn't have any verbal testimony, we did have 2 letters submitted that are posted in the chat as 2.0A and 2.0B relating to this docket item.
Okay. And I haven't reviewed the letters. Can you just tell us the nature of those letters, Guthrie? Don't have to read them, just tell us the nature.
Yes. The nature of the letters are in support of the docket item. And the first letter is from Kelly Minty, Chair of the Klamath County Board of Commissioners, as well as David Hensley, Commissioner on the Klamath County Board of Commissioners. And the second letter, and I believe there was one that was signed in absentia by a member of the Klamath County Board of Commissioners. Let me just check. Yes, it was Derek DeGroot was not present. And then the second letter, 2.0b, is a letter in support from Representative Ken Helm, Chair of the House Committee on Agriculture, Land Use, and Water, Representative Mark Owens, Vice Chair of the House Committee on Agriculture, Land Use, and Water, Representative Vicky Breeze Iverson, House Republican Leader, and Representative E. Werner Renschke, House Oregon State Legislator, House District 56.
Thank you, Guthrie. I think that's important for the record for us to get that information in too. So I'll entertain a motion to forward this to the full commission with a due pass recommendation. I have a motion.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner Devlin,
Second.
second by Commissioner Adams. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. The next docket item is our discussion presentation by Jim Pinkard on our tuition review process. As you all know, the HECC, one of our responsibilities is to review any and approve any tuition increases over 5%. We've been through that a few times and had lots of learning along the way. And every time we learn about this process, I think we get more refined and better at it. So, Jim, I'll let you take it away because this has to do with making sure we are having a process in rule in our rules language. Is that so?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful sunny fall afternoon. Certainly sunny where I am at. For the record, Jim Pinkard, Post Secretary of Finance and Capital, and this does exactly as Commissioner Cross described. Essentially, this is a proposed rule that would implement in rule our current practice. And so I appreciate Commissioner Cross's kind comments. It is a learning opportunity every time we do this, and we're trying to get better. We're not asking today for you to take action on this. This is a rule, a draft rule, brand new rule that has yet to be added to the Oregon Administrative Rules that we have not yet posted with the Secretary of State. I felt it important to put this draft rule on a piece of paper and then bring it to you for your consideration, for your input, your perspective. And so then after that, after your input and perspective, then we can post it with the Secretary of State, go through the formal rule adoption process, which means we would likely bring it back for your approval, the full commission's approval, likely at the February commission meeting. So I just wanted to walk you through some of the finer points. Many of this you're familiar with, but there are a couple of details that you may be not as familiar with because you only deal with this occasionally. The last time, by the way, that we had a greater than 5% increase was back in 2019. So it's been 3 years. But every year in the spring and in April, March, or March, April, May, around that time frame, if you recall, we commit as staff to bring you information on all of the increases that are being proposed by all 7 of the universities, irregardless of whether they exceed the 5% threshold or not. So I do want to reinforce that commitment going forward. We will continue, as has been our past practice, to bring information to you about what the tuition and fees charges are across all 7 universities. But I think it's important to start out by saying on page 2 of the docket item, we define tuition as tuition for 45 credits in a given academic year. So this includes the fall, the winter, and the spring. So if a student enrolls in summer, that's kind of excluded from this calculation process. And also, too, we only look at base tuition. Differential tuition is not a part of this calculation formally, and by DOJ interpretation, because over the past years, we've reached out and received from the Oregon Department of Justice interpretation as to exactly how we should implement this. And in fact, it was their recommendation to put it in rule. But their recommendation, their interpretation is that we should conduct a holistic review, not of all the students. What is the average student paying versus looking at students in a particular major or in a particular program by themselves. So tuition defined a very specific way, as are mandatory enrollment fees. So when we say mandatory enrollment fees, we're talking about those fees that are applicable to all undergraduate resident students as a necessary condition of enrollment. So this does not include course-based fees. So like if there's an equipment fee for an art class, for example, that would be excluded from this calculation process. And then there are fees for specific services, like there's a parking permit fee or something like that. Those fees are excluded as well. And also if there are non-recurring fees. So for example, if there's a matriculation fee, a one-time matriculation fee that is applicable to all students, it is still, because of its non-recurring nature, excluded from the calculation methodology. We also exclude mandatory incidental enrollment fees. Incidental fees, that's by statute, but the incidental fees are those fees that are mandatory, but they're set by the recognized student government association at each campus. And so the student government association sets the fee and then determines how that fee is spent or allocated or budgeted. So the mandatory incidental fees, mandatory incidental enrollment fees are excluded. So on pages 2 and 3, we walk you through how the calculation occurs step by step, kind of straightforward. There's in example 1, an increase calculation, and this is exactly how we calculate it. Essentially, it's a year-to-year comparison with tuition and mandatory enrollment fees. But there are some questions. For example, if we have an institution that charges a cohort tuition, meaning there's a tuition fee charged for a certain group of students, but different groups of students pay a different rate. We see this at University of Oregon with their guaranteed tuition program. How do we handle that? And so we use what is called essentially a weighted average approach. And that's spelled out in example 2 on the top of page 4, where essentially we take each cohort, we calculate the increase, and then we use a weighted average approach from there. The same weighted average approach is used for different campuses. So Oregon State University, with Corvallis versus Cascades, we calculate the increase for each campus, and it has been and will continue to be our practice to present that information by campus, but the 5% threshold is applied across the entire university. Mm-hmm. So we use a weighted average for the cohorts at each campus and then across the entire university to apply then the 5% threshold. In the rule, in the draft rule that is included in the appendix, we also talk about the process that an institution goes through if they're requesting an increase greater than 5%. So that starts on page 4. Essentially, their board is expected to take action and adopt their staff's recommendation. That's kind of the initial incident. When the board takes action to approve an increase greater than 5%, that then is the start of the clock, after which 7 calendar days, the university must officially notify us of that action, and then must provide to us as HECC staff a number of documents. There are 13 listed at the top of page 4 and onto page 5. It's actually a lot of information that we request from the universities and from the tuition setting advisory bodies, because each university under state law uses and has to use a tuition advisory body every year to inform its board's tuition setting process. And again, under state law, there must be a minimum number of members. I believe it's 8, of which 4 must be students. So they're required by law to include the use of a tuition advisory body and a substantial student representation on that tuition setting body. So all those materials considered by that tuition setting body and other documentation must be sent to us. And then 14 days after the institution's governing board formally adopts the increase, we're looking to solicit any other additional information from their recognized student government or from any stakeholders that want to provide information. Generally, we'd love to see that within 14 days after, but of course we can accept it after that as well. But that would certainly help in our staff's deliberations and considerations. The consideration of the request will occur during a public meeting of the full commission. Due to the timeline of the university's budget setting process, that normally occurs at the June meeting of our full commission, but the exact timing could depend based on circumstance. During that public meeting, we intend to hear public testimony specific to the request. The institutions are typically invited to present their request, and then HECC staff will provide a detailed recommendation, and our staff recommendation will be included with the meeting materials, which means they'll be available to the public and posted on our website, typically before the meeting occurs. So what criteria do we use? Which is on page 6. These criteria originally were formed back in late 2017 and early 2018. They were adopted in 2018 and then again adopted in 2019 and 2020, and I think may have been adopted in 2021, or maybe the latest adoption was December 2020. But these criteria we have been consistently using for the last 4 years now. And so I've placed these criteria in the rule language. Again, you can see that in the appendix. And so the rule attempts to, again, do nothing more than lay out what our current practice is. This provides clarity to our stakeholders so they know what to expect. Not just as the criteria, but also during the process. What can they expect throughout the entirety of the process, and how we engage with that with you as commissioners and with the stakeholders. So again, you don't need to take formal action, but I would certainly love to hear your comments, your feedback, suggestions, ways we can improve this draft language. I will finally say in closing that it is our intent to continue. We have been working with stakeholders. I sent them a copy of this draft language about a month ago. They've had a chance to look at it, but we'll continue to work with them on making this language better, improving it as we look to bring it to your full commission in February or thereabouts for consideration then. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Devlin?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have kind of a different question about this. I'm looking at example 2, and that's the example of with multiple cohorts. And I know this has been used. I've seen it at least 1 or 2 times in recent years, where this has been used so that overall the increase in a university is still less than the 5%. The question I have is kind of a different question, though. I remember when this legislation was passed. Obviously, I was there when it was passed. And I know that some members had concerns about the increased cost to students, but they also had an concern about the increased cost of entry. And when it's structured like this, and you could basically not have to come to HECC for approval, just by increasing your cohort, your incoming cohort greater. For example, in this example, I'm not saying that they would do this, but if you were every new cohort you gave a 7.5% increase to over a 5-year period, compounding it yearly, you'd have about a 43% increase overall in tuition, or this 13,006 would be somewhere in the 19,000s by then. And what I'm wondering about is getting a little bit esoteric here, but is there a basis for this determination in statute, or is there a basis in legislative intent? Was there ever anything that came up about legislative intent? Obviously, if the statute is clear, legislative intent doesn't matter. But if the statute's not clear, then usually you have to look at legislative intent.
There was from, I see Ben popping up, so I didn't know if Ben, you wanted to address that first, but I'll say that we reached out to the Department of Justice about, not necessarily about a guaranteed tuition program, but about how do we address the issue of what happens when you have one group of students who is charged a different rate than a second group of students than another. And so based on the feedback we received from DOJ attorneys, we have decided to use a weighted average approach. And your esoteric point, I think, is well taken. Certainly that, you know, it could lead over time to an increase in tuition, but the legislative intent was a little unclear, because essentially what they're doing is they're guaranteeing that tuition. So you have a student who starts in 1 year, for 4 years straight, they pay exactly the same tuition. Yeah. Their tuition during that 4-year period never changes. So when you have one cohort versus a second, then the increase from one cohort to the second cohort, yes, could exceed 5%, but that new tuition plateau, if you want to call it, is going to remain exactly the same for 4 years straight for that group of students.
Right.
So I think it's a fair question to ask what was the legislative intent then, and I think there was a bit of uncertainty around that, because there was the question at that time was not asked about what if an institution implements a guaranteed tuition program, or like Oregon State University did during the pandemic. They tried to essentially, during the pandemic, they said, we're going to take a year or two off. We're going to, because we got additional federal resources through COVID response at the federal level, we're going to keep tuition exactly the same. And that created, although I don't think it was really their intent to create different cohorts, it created cohorts, because you had then a group of students who entered when the tuition was capped, and then you had a different group of students. So now you had 2 cohorts. So we're trying as best we can to navigate how we best are mindful of the 5% threshold, but at the same time recognize that there are different cohort rates. Yeah. For students.
Well, I'll probably do some further exploration of this. I'm just a little bit concerned, because I do think the legislature had 2 concerns. One was the increasing cost to existing students, and the second was the increasing cost of entry. Now, the other side of this, and I'm trying to be as direct as I can, is the more burden that can be placed on students, the less the legislature actually sees the underlying need for state support. It's not as visible as the institutions coming in for a significant increase, because they don't really see the significant increase, except for perhaps being contacted by students or something like that. And I mean, we can actually see that even under this system, there have been very substantial increases in tuition over the last 10 years. And I'm just a little bit concerned about what the legislative intent is. And I understand if the statute is clear, then the legislative intent doesn't really matter. And I also understand that sometimes it's very difficult to determine what legislative intent is. So I just wanted to get that on the record.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin. I think some of the history is that the institutions wanted predictability and dependability and how the increases were being considered, and so the effort, the weighted average, was a way for the staff to get at that. Commissioner Hayman, your hand is up.
Thank you, Chair Cross. This may be as esoteric as Commissioner Devlin's, but of a different sort. I guess I'm going back to actually what Commissioner Devlin said. What I love about what this does is it gives us a really clear understanding of the process that an institution uses to establish its tuition increase. And I think perhaps in the absence of this, we wouldn't have that level of clarity. And I love that. I just think it helps us to understand the kinds of considerations that an institution makes in making a very difficult decision. I don't think there's any institution out there that goes, yeah, let's raise tuition. It's an exciting idea. I think they do it on the basis of a whole lot of conditions and needs that go into that model. And I go back to the issue of legislative intent, which I don't understand near as much as Commissioner Devlin when he was in the legislature. So, but you did state it, some way of controlling the cost that the student incurs. And I've just wondered if we've ever thought about, we sort of parse that cost out and only look at one thing. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense that that way of looking at trying to control costs encourages institutions to try to distribute costs across other means other than tuition, and we really don't have a very good handle on controlling the actual cost that a student experiences when they go to college. And I'll bring in my own experience. I think we tried, and community colleges don't fall under the same legislation, but for the sake of the students' understanding of the actual cost, we thought it was beneficial to actually get rid of all those fees and drive it all into tuition so that students would have a much clearer understanding of what is really going to cost them to go there. And I'm just wondering if we've thought at all about how this approach to trying to control costs perhaps doesn't always serve that legislative intent that I think Commissioner Devlin has met. I told you it was going to be esoteric. I'm sorry.
I think at the universities have I think my answer will add value. If it doesn't, please let me know if it doesn't. But I think the universities have culturally a bit of a different approach because many of them, require their entering freshmen live on campus, and the experience of the university student is a little bit different than the average experience of the community college student. And so I think, for the colleges, it makes, I think, more sense than it does the universities to do what you're describing, which is, charge a fee. And I think some of the colleges too charge essentially one fee, that's it. And then that fee revenue is used to pay for any number of different things. The universities, I think, tend to take a bit of a more of an a la carte approach. If you want to be if you want to major in a very high cost degree program, then we might add a differential tuition for students in that major. If you want to, regardless of major, take a high cost course that requires additional expense, we may charge a course fee to accommodate that. If you want to use our student healthcare service center, that's an auxiliary service, and so you're not required to, you can, but then there may be a student fee for that as well. So I think at the universities, there's more of an a la carte approach, and then the student is allowed to, from that perspective, kind of design the structure that they need for them in their academic pursuits. But that's also, there's recognition that in the last 10, 15 years, when you look at the total cost of a student's attendance, about half that cost is tuition and fees. The other half, 50 to 55%, is living expenses, room and board, transportation, all that. And that's the part that we've really seen a lot of escalation on as well. So one of the challenges, and we hear this a lot from students, the cost of going to college has really gone up. And then when we get into a more nuanced conversation around that, we find that some of that price challenge, some of that cost inflationary pressure is really from housing, from food, from other costs, other elements of the cost structure that are somewhat unrelated to tuition and fees. And so I don't know that I have the best answer on how to manage all that. But I think when we collectively are concerned about the cost of a student's attendance, we have to get into some of those details and really figure out, I think to your point, Commissioner Heyman, how complicated is this for the university governing boards and the community college boards to set these fees? But then from the student's perspective, if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of our students, the cost of housing has really gone up. The cost of food has really gone up. The cost of transportation has really gone up. So the totality of all that informs their affordability experience. But the boards, the governing boards themselves, only can control what they can control on their campus from their perspective. So the conversation gets complicated quick. And I think part of what Chair Cross mentioned at the beginning of this item is, as staff, I'm constantly interested in and working toward trying to provide more clarity around what that looks like. And so I don't know that I have the best answer, but I'm committed to additional clarity around what the cost experience is for the average student. The universities do have, and I'll zip it in about 15 seconds, but the students, the universities do have cost of attendance calculators that students can use to try to, if I take this major and register in this many courses, here's what it will likely cost. And so I think they're trying as best they can. We're trying as best we can. And I know the governing boards are trying the best they can as to at least add clarity around what those fee structures are.
Commissioner Simnett and then Commissioner Adams.
I think Commissioner Adams was ahead of me.
Okay.
Oh, no worries. Well, one thing I'd like to underscore are the comments of Commissioner Devlin and Commissioner Heyman on the impact on the student. I understand that we're a funding organization and we fund the institutions, but it feels like one more category needs to be in there. And I don't quite know what it is, but something feels like needs to be considered, at least from the student's perspective. My other question for you, Jim, is one other area I wonder if you all considered in 2019 are the system-wide effects of these increases. The criteria that I'm looking at on page 6 seem like they focus on the individual ask or the individual transaction, but the accumulation, the institution, the system-wide effects seem like something that should be considered. And the reason why that's coming to mind for me is that unlike 2019, we likely will see the impact of inflation and inflationary pressure on some of these budgets over the next few years, and there may be system-wide pressures that may lead to needs, the need to ask for increased budgets or costs for students or tuition for students. And so I wonder what you think about the system-wide perspective on it, not just the transactional ask.
Thank you for the question. I think I'm going to fail miserably in my response because I have spent recently, thinking about that. I just don't have a good answer to it. I think that we're concerned about, that pricing pressure as it relates to inflation. Let me say it this way. I was looking last month at CPI data that comes from the BLS Department of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they split it out by category. You know, airline prices are up 40% year over year, rental car prices are up. But on the flip side, they said college tuition prices are actually down 2%. And so I thought, okay, that's perhaps good news, right? That tuition prices are not at the 7-8% increases like other elements of a consumer's cost experience. But at the same time, housing has gone up, gas has gone up, food has gone up, all these other costs have gone up. And so while tuition and fees likely have been tamed in the short term recently by the influence and receipt of federal dollars, because in Oregon, our public and private institutions collectively received over $700 million in federal pandemic-related assistance. And so they used a lot of that money to prevent, increasing tuition and fees and all that. However, in the short term. However, when we talk to students, though, they're like, but my expense in going to college is still growing. So I think you're 100% right. It's a larger system issue, but the only way in my mind I can make sense of it is by bifurcating the experience, the tuition and fee side versus the all other expense, cost of going to school side. That is really growing fast. And so, but that speaks to a larger, to your point, systematic issue. And we heard when I went out this summer and went to 15 different institutions, and I know the student, the legislative committee, the name of which slips my mind, when they've gone on their site visits, they're hearing students express, but we're still concerned about affordability. And they're concerned about the cost. One of the community colleges, I heard very clearly, students were telling us and staff were telling us about childcare. I can't get you, even if I can afford to pay for child, I can't get it in my area. I can't put my kids in childcare. So there's not just even the greater cost of affording childcare, there's the lack of childcare. And so these are some issues that our state legislature is working on. In the last legislative session, the state appropriated about $100 million alone to try to tackle childcare. Part of that money came to us here at the HECC. We received $21 million to distribute to Portland State University. They're going to work with a consortium of stakeholders to provide grants to those workers who work in childcare at childcare providers to incentivize an increase in employment at childcare providers, because during the pandemic in the state of Oregon, about a third, almost a half of all childcare providers went out of business. So that's a real big issue. If you're a returning adult student and you need childcare to attend class and you can't find it, that's your impediment, right? So the state legislature recognizes that. They're trying to housing the same way. The state legislature appropriated, I think, $400 million to work on different elements of housing affordability, including homelessness services at the county and city level, building more affordable homes in different areas and stuff. So that $500 million investment by the state legislature to address childcare and housing, we hope will help tackle some of those systematic issues. And over time, we hope to see that address some of the concerns we're really hearing from students.
That makes sense. My thinking, though, was not on the overall, the escalation of cost of the other things, but whether or not a greater than 5% ask at one of the 7 institutions is really one that we should think about and how it affects all of the institutions. So by system-wide, I meant the others. And I know that I have to think 5 years ahead of where we are in my day job. And what I see a few years out is the combination of the inflationary pressure plus a decline in capital markets, which means pension costs go up, right? So all of these institutions are going to have some pressure on tuition, even if it's not apparent now. it is coming. And so so my question for you was, do you ever get more than one ask at a time, or do you try to anticipate asks that will likely come as a result of macroeconomic factors that we know will impact funding?
Thank you. That is a great question. So typically how it's worked in the past, in 2019, we got requests from, I believe it was 4 of the 7. The biennium before in 2017, I believe they got requests from 2 or 3. I wasn't here at the time. It's important to understand the reason they occur in odd years is because that's when the state legislature meets and there's uncertainty as to exactly how much money the state will be able to afford to appropriate to support higher ed. And that's also when the state legislature has to decide how much PERS is going to receive in state support as well. And so the PERS rates are still kind of in flux. The state legislature is decision making around how much for university and community college support is still in flux. And so that's often when the universities and colleges have to do some estimating work. Some of them will call it guesstimating work around their operating budgets and how much they'll need. And so, but I, in the past, can tell you that we as a staff have not endeavored to be proactive really about forecasting, who may come for a greater than 5% increase. I can tell you that we monitor the tuition setting process every year at all 7 of the universities. And so we ought to the point where we often, before the pandemic, I would actually go to the campus and participate in some of those conversations. And those are always enlightening. And I'm looking to get back in the habit of that this fall. I will likely do some visits to some of the institutions to participate and observe. We're there just to observe. But that observation allows us to try to see as early as November, December, who may or may not be seeking a request. And in the spring, around March is when, usually in February is when we have some indication. But in March is when I try to come to the F&A and provide updates and say, here's who I think may be coming or may not. But I can't claim that we in a very legitimate, proactive way seek to understand in the long term, in the future, who's under that pressure, other than to say on the enrollment side, we do try to endeavor to understand their enrollment pressures, because that is a proxy for the financial revenues, right? So enrollment is kind of the canary in the coal mine. And so you'll hear tomorrow, Dr. Amy Cox from Research and Data talk a little bit about enrollment and what that means as we collect the 4th week census date information from the institutions. But that enrollment information is really important because that gives us financially an idea of the how challenging their financial viability will be. And so also too, I'll point out in December, for the last couple of years, we've gotten into the habit of bringing an update to the F&A about where their financial situation is, what it looks like, their E&G budget especially. And we're going to do that again this year. So at next month's F&A meeting, we'll likely bring to you their current budget, E&G budget status, what that looks like, and how that's playing out, because I think that may get at some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And are any of the current commissioners, were you all, 2 or 3 of you were on in 2019, right? When the discussion.
Yeah, I will address that because back in 2017, I think there were actually 5 or 6 requests over the 5%, and we had part of the reason you're seeing criteria in front of you is because we had very little guidance in how to make that, because it was fairly new. And we had quite a bit of controversy and lots of students, attending our decision meetings. And, I think the institutions were asking for transparency and consistency. The governor weighed in with a letter on how she would like the decision to be made. But we had just recently, it's fairly new that the HEC had that responsibility to approve increases over the 5%. And as a result of what felt at the time like a clunky process, the staff worked hard to come up with some clearer criteria. And in the following biennium, several of us as commissioners actually traveled out to attend trustee meetings across the state. I went to Eastern and Southern, and others went different places to sit with through a tuition setting advisory board meeting at each institution or board of trustees, because we were trying to gather information and educate ourselves about what this process really looks like through the whole system. So you're kind of seeing the fruit of some painful growth in those first few years. So, Emily, you've been waiting.
And waiting and listening. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I would also just say a big thank you to all of the discussion that has and information that has happened. As a new member to this committee and new to the commission, this is really valuable background information to me. I had like a small a question of curiosity. But I did have a comment about the importance of having that contextual piece with when tuition increases come forward, and by contextual piece, I'm thinking about housing prices and those other factors. Housing is something that I hear from the students that I'm working with on my campus all the time. It pops up into their assignments that are not related to discussing the cost of housing. I mean, because these are things that are on students' minds, and they're really things that affect their ability, even after they've made the decision to come to enroll in school and have paid their tuition. Housing and other cost of living factors are very they really can impact how successful a student is. So I would just appreciate that as we're having these conversations, and then potentially having the tuition increases coming before us in the next time, having that kind of contextual information. And I don't know what that looks like in criteria or requiring institutions to do it, but it would be useful for me. And I would imagine that students would have a lot to say about that as well. My two really minor, I guess, clarification questions was and maybe they've mostly been answered, but I'm just curious about how you have been working with students on this particular language as one of the stakeholders in this discussion. And then, so that's one question. And then the other question is just a technical question. For tuition increases for non-residents, is that just up to each individual institution's governing board, or is that ever a factor or something that comes up in discussion, or what's the relationship, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So the statutory responsibility of the commission is really around Oregon resident students, undergraduate resident students. And so the university boards have flexibility and freedom to set rates as they so choose for resident graduate students, and non-resident undergraduate and graduate. So they have within statute, you know, the freedom to set those rates as they see fit. So the 5% threshold only applies, and throughout the language, rule language, and others, we continually reference, you know, undergraduate resident students. That's not to say we're unconcerned about the cost of attendance for non-residents or graduate students. That's just to say the policy of most stakeholders in Oregon has been in the past to ensure that limited state resources are applicable to Oregon residents first. And I think to the point where some have in the past expressed, you know, we wish we had more money to put in the formula for non-residents and others, and but that's where that is. And so I think that's why the statute kind of became that. I see Commissioner Devlin's hand is up.
And yes, Commissioner Devlin.
One of the things that I don't know if it's universal, but that I've seen over recent years, there may be some exceptions to this, but the non-resident tuition is almost set by the market. Because once they get to a certain point and they start losing students, they lose net revenue. And so sometimes it's not possible to increase the non-resident tuition, and sometimes it is. But I mean, generally, non-resident tuition is very expensive in this state. I mean, it's still a bargain compared to most private institutions, although the private institutions probably offer better financial packages, to be honest, but financial aid packages. But I think it's basically set by the market.
That is true. Yeah, I will say that in Oregon, we're a net importer of students. And so when you look at the population of the students at the 7 universities, about a third of their undergraduate students are non-residents. And at University of Oregon, it's about half of their undergraduate students are non-residents. OSU, I think, is about 35 to 40%, and some of the other schools, but about a third in total. So we know from student movement and from National Student Clearinghouse data that the state of Oregon is a net importer, as in there are about 20 to 30,000 more students who come into the state of Oregon from neighboring states, including Arizona, Colorado, to come to, and California, that come to school here, versus Oregon high school students who leave to go there. So I think your point is well taken, is that the market is setting some of those guidelines, and that of course was something that weighed very heavily on the governing board of University of Oregon's decision to implement that guaranteed tuition plan, because University of Colorado at Boulder and some of the other out-of-state competitors were switching to guaranteed tuition and setting that market rate. So U of O felt compelled to respond.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
Also, I do think it's not under our purview, but obviously to the extent of what levels of increases we have in graduate tuition has an impact on those students that would want to either go on to graduate school or come back to go to graduate school. I mean, and we can't probably lose sight of that, even though we don't have any authority in that area, I believe.
I think that's a valuable point, and maybe more, we should come back to that for more discussion when we're talking about the overall support, and the report that we're going to hear about tomorrow, I think, addresses that issue. I want to give one more bit of information, basically in response to Commissioner Adams' question, is historical context. So I pointed out that in 2017, I believe there were 5 or 6 requests over 5%, some of them as high as 10 or 11% or higher. And the commission actually rejected those requests. Much to the surprise of the institution, I think we were trying to be diligent about this new responsibility that we had, and as and Ben can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that when institutions did not get that approval immediately. They went back and reformulated their requests, and we ended up approving requests over 5%, but much more in a leveling playing field. So there was, and everybody was coming in at those higher requests because of the economics of the moment. So your question earlier about the context of, and there will be times when people come in for those requests. My sense is that this also relates back to Commissioner Devlin's original question about legislative intent, and the intent was to control what might have been perceived at the time as runaway cost increases, and I think that was accomplished because since that very painful spring in 2017, when we had to make extremely difficult decisions, I think the process has gotten much more thoughtful, and we have had to consider far fewer requests over 5%. And I guess I would call on Ben if there's any. Is that a fair summary?
It is. Thanks, Chair Cross. And I would also, just to come back to Commissioner Devlin's original comment, I think one piece of information we can provide, and his sort of question comment sort of sparked my interest on that, is to look at the cost for the tuition and mandatory fee cost for incoming students over the past 7-8 years that this has been in place, and to see what those increases have been sort of annualized, right, with this policy in place. And I think that notwithstanding the potential under this policy for that rate of increase to exceed 5%, given the cohort approach, in practice, I don't think that has occurred, but I want to look at the data, and I recognize the concern. I know this is taking us way back in the conversation, but I recognize the concern about that possibility under a cohort-based model. We did a lot of work when we initially were handed this responsibility with DOJ and with our institutional partners to try to figure out how would we even determine when they in practice are charging different tuition to different individual students. Yes, there's a published price, but that isn't, but in actual practice, increasingly, you pay different amounts on almost an individual basis for a variety of reasons, including, tuition differentials for certain programs and other factors that Jim mentioned. It's a real tricky question to determine even what their tuition is for the purposes of 5%. And I think the definition that we're recommending here is one that works pretty well through the inclusion of mandatory fees, but not non-mandatory ones, and through the weighted cohort. But I think there's more for us to share, and we'll get back with some of that data.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I just want to state that I actually like the director. I don't believe that this has been misused in a sense. I'm just concerned about the potential of it being misused.
Yeah. So noted. Thank you. Well, Jim, thank you for all of your information on this very complex issue. It on the surface, it seems like it should be easy to control costs at 5%, and in reality, the details make this extremely complicated. And I appreciate the response to the concerns of the institutions. What I learned and have tried to hold to throughout my tenure on the commission is that as a commission, we're responsible for consistently applying policy statewide. And the institution's responsibility is to be the best institutions they can be. And sometimes those two things bump into one another. And our processes need to resolve that rub in the interests of the students that we serve, and all residents of Oregon. I think is our charge. So that's the guidance we used to try to inform staff on what what the criteria needed to be. So I hope that's helpful. One more docket item on our agenda today, and that's the Community College Support Fund. And once again, Jim Pinkard and Donald Llewellyn. So.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do at this point invite Donald Llewellyn, my colleague and the director of the Community College Workforce Development Division. Hi, Donna. So to talk about the Community College Support Fund review process, it's been a lengthy process, and the pace of the process is picking up, which I am excited about. I do, although recognize it is a bit of a messy process for some. I think we're making great progress in it. And so the docket item kind of walks you through some of the feedback that we've heard from different stakeholder groups involved in this process and in these conversations, including feedback we've heard from the Oregon President's Council, feedback we've heard from the Community College Support Fund Review Work Group itself, which is about 25 members strong. And then also there's some information and perspective from the Oregon Higher Education Landscape Study included, which you'll hear more about tomorrow at the full commission. But in this docket item, we kind of tease out some of those elements specific to the review process. But I think what we're today hoping to hear is your perspective, your opinion, your advice on some remaining policy questions that exist that have come up throughout the process. And so not asking for action today, just perspective. We will at the December meeting next month bring you hopefully more of a framework, and some of the stakeholders from the review work group will hopefully join us for that conversation. So we'll make progress continuing into next month as we march toward what we hope will be a consensus-based set of HECC staff recommendations for February. But today there are, in principle, two kind of policy areas that we want to talk about, two themes. One is support for focusing on underrepresented students. We think the work group generally agrees that, you know, there's an opportunity to focus a little bit more on that. The current formula is enrollment driven, doesn't differentiate between type of student we're trying to serve. There was a research report just published by the Institute of Education Sciences as it was done for Texas, because Texas is right now at the tail end of reviewing its community college funding formula. And one of the sentences I'll quote directly from this report, I like it so much. It says, for community college funding systems to be equitable, they must account for the different levels of support needed to provide students from different backgrounds an equal opportunity to succeed. And I think there's, although we haven't asked specifically whether people support that, I think generally the work group is headed that direction in concurrence with that statement. The question is, how do we do that, right? How do you infuse student success and funding for that into the formula? So we talked about in more specific terms what types of populations of students or what student success characteristics we should pursue in the formula. We've talked about underserved people of color, racial, ethnic minority. We've talked about low-income learners. We've talked about rural learners, all three of whom are listed within our existing adult attainment goal for Oregon. So the question is, should we use those, or should we use adult students in particular and use that as a proxy for all three of those groups? How do we do that in light of the data challenges that we have? I think low income would be great to use. However, only about a third of community college students in a given year file a complete FAFSA or ORSA. So if you have only a third of those students filling out the information, filling out the forms that we would need to determine whether they're low income or not, that means 2/3 of the students are not filling out. We wouldn't have that data. So is it reasonable to use that metric or not? When we talk racial ethnic minority, about 80% of students fill out that data. They volunteer that information. About 20% of students do not. So is 80% enough data upon which to design that metric or not? I will say, full disclosure, for the university funding formula, we use low income as one of our targeted populations within the outcome metric. That is, Pell eligibility is the proxy for low income, which I know has its own issues. Pell eligibility is seen as not the best proxy necessarily, but we do use it in their funding formula, and we also use race and ethnic minority as well. So that's kind of one of the topics we wanted to bring to the fore for your consideration. And the other issue is CTE coursework. How do we, what we've heard from, especially the community college presidents, is that community or career and technical education CTE coursework is more expensive to offer. Certainly should reflect workforce need, should reflect high demand areas of need in the state's economy. How do you define those? Who gets to define those? What does that look like? And are there resources available for starting those programs up, or are we truly talking about in the formula, are we truly talking about reimbursing the higher cost of those? What does that look like? So it's really those two areas. At this point, I will say that we just had yesterday afternoon a meeting with the work group, and so I may be missing a couple of topics because those, of course, weren't included in the docket item, and so I'll invite Donna in to correct that.
Good Good afternoon, Chair Cross and members of the Commission. For the record, I am Donna Llewellyn, Director of the Office of Community Colleges and Workforce Development. Much of what Jim already said, I will echo. There has been quite a bit of conversation about adult learners, adult educational attainment. As he indicated, career technical education does continue to be one of those topics where we are looking to lean in, or at least the work group looks to be leaning in. Jim already described some of the data pieces that we're taking into consideration as we discuss how to get to measuring or identifying potential priority populations that we may want to focus in on. One of the things that I think is important is that the Commission has already defined a few areas of policy with regards to the adult learner attainment goal. And so there is some growing interest to not reinvent per se the wheel, and to stay in alignment with some of those important policy decisions that the Commission has made over the last couple of years. The work continues to be spirited in conversation. I think that there has been quite a bit of progress made over the course of the last couple of meetings, but there's still quite a bit of work to be done between now and February, when you have indicated that you would like to have have a recommendation from us as staff. So with that, I think Jim and I are open to answer any questions you may have, and if we don't know the answer, we will take it back to the work group and see about bringing it back to you.
Commissioner Devlin, did you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, or just a statement, maybe a response. I appreciate Mr. Pinkert and Ms. Llewellyn. Well, my eyesight on these is still Llewellyn.
Yeah, Llewellyn.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure the Commission is aware of this, but I want to echo Mr. Pinkert about data, because in our state school formula, the formula for K-12, we have very good data. So there's a lot of weighting that's dependent upon English as a second language, students in poverty, IEP students, IEP is what we used to refer to as special education students, be politically correct here. And then even such small categories as pregnant students. But we have extensive and accurate data for that from school districts. And I think that's a big difference, actually. I'm not saying we shouldn't take this into consideration, but it's going to have to search for a way to do it that is to some degree accurate. One of the concerns I have about CTE is I do believe it's more expensive, sometimes significantly more expensive. But if you weight CTE higher and you don't give community colleges more, then those classes that are not CTE could end up seriously underfunded. And some of those classes are the classes that fit right into the module to go on to a four-year institution. English is not a CTE subject. Social science is not there's just so many areas there. So obviously, I do think there are areas in CTE that are clearly more expensive. And we do recognize that obviously for universities in terms of the cost of the programs they offer. So just want to put that on the record.
Thank you. Commissioner Devlin.
Commissioner Hayman.
Commissioner Hayman, you're on mute right now.
I guess I wanted to focus more on your comments about how there's I think a broad assumption, and I think it's a true one, that we're all interested in achieving more equitable outcomes. It's certainly within our statement as HECC, and I think every one of the institutions has that somewhere within their mission. And so the question is there a role for a funding model to support that effort more effectively, I guess is, and it is true that we don't have complete, sort of income data on students. We also don't have complete race information on our students because that's a voluntary information piece, and there are a significant number of students who choose not to provide that. Just thinking about, if the issue of the level of data we have is roughly equivalent across X number of institutions, and you're using a formula to distribute funds, you could, I think, pretty safely assume that even with incomplete information, you could approximate a pretty equitable distribution of the resource for that purpose. So I don't know what the answer is. I think I just, as a commissioner, am interested in at least feeling out perhaps more effective ways of using our resources to support more equitable outcomes for the students. And I'm real interested in knowing what you think are the most effective. All of them, to some extent, are proxies, but the most effective single or mix of proxies that we think we can incorporate into a model to achieve that purpose.
So Commissioner Hayman and Chair Cross, I know that Director Cox from the Office of Research and Data is also here on the call. I'd feel much more confident in allowing her to speak to that particular inquiry about what data is available. Amy, any chance you might be able to chime in?
Sure, there we go. Sorry, camera issue. Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, Chair Cross, members of the commission. For the record, my name is Amy Cox, and I'm the director of the Office of Research and Data. And I did have the pleasure of sitting in with the work group yesterday as they were navigating some of these questions. And I'll share with you some of what I said to them, which is that as Commissioner Devlin noted, or implied perhaps, we're in a slightly different situation with adults, those age 18 and up, for data collection than we are with children. There are also some federal differences in terms of regulations, but where much of the information that we have about adults is voluntary, whether or not they want to share their identity around race, ethnicity, or gender, or other characteristics that we often use to measure gaps in equity and gaps in opportunity. And what I will say is that while those data are incomplete at the community college level, I will not pretend they're not, the data we have are strong and solid. And that's because despite significant process differences on each campus, we have a standardized way that the campuses report those data to the HECC. And so that's one piece I would want to convey. Another piece that I would want to convey to you that I said to them is that, many times I'm in situations where, it's incumbent upon me to measure multifaceted and complex social phenomena, if you will. And community colleges are multifaceted institutions with with multiple missions, and that's their strength. And it is all the more reason that I would suggest that multiple ways of measuring equity can actually serve the formula well, because it would allow us to not rely on any single data point, which may be very valuable, but is not available for all students, to avoid having a formula rely on one data point, and actually to allow it to capture the multifaceted missions of colleges and the multifaceted nature of their student body more completely. And so some of those ways that we use students' characteristics to measure gaps in equity include, sorry, a little noise upstairs, race, ethnicity, age, income, rural urban background, veteran status, and I'm forgetting another one that I wanted to state, and I apologize. But as an example, no one of those data points is perfect in the community college data. But as a whole, they can provide a more complex picture and a more, I think, accurate picture.
And I think if I could, just for a quick second, I'll point out, so the report that comes from Texas, which I really appreciate, because they attempted to look at 5 different research questions, but first and foremost, they tried to identify what student need factors are most strongly associated with college outcomes. They tried to really dig into, which of those factors really, and they prioritized them. And so, at least for Texas, what they found was that, the percentage of students who are first generation and the percentage of students who are older than 24 were kind of the top, right? You address that, and you're really going to cook with grease, right? And so I think that's why, to their credit, the work group is focusing on adults, and I think that's why, if we as the HECC can take a little credit, I think that's why we created the adult attainment goal in the first place. And so I think, to underscore what Donna was saying earlier, I think, maybe it's enough to say, let's focus on, student success as it relates to those 3 types of students that are already mentioned in the adult attainment goal, noting, as Amy did, it's none of those data points by themselves will be perfect, but in totality, we think we should endeavor to head that direction. But circling back to the report in Texas, so percentage of students who were first generation, and then students who were older than 24, followed then by students who were academically disadvantaged, not college ready, and then followed by students who were earning less than 30,000, who came from a household with less than 30,000 in income, so that low income, and then followed by percentage of students who are English learner students. And so they actually, I think this study is the first I've seen that actually goes that far to say, if you really want to be an efficient in your formula design, this is perhaps how you can do that. So I think our adult attainment goal is heading the right direction. I think if we were to then work on doing the same and aligning this with that adult learner goal, I think we'd be doing right by ourselves. So I'll just tease that information out of that Texas report.
Thank you. I would point out, and just, you asked, your original question is about what are the high level policy goals that we want to see underlie this formula as it comes forward, and I think the lead of that is the outcomes driven, at least having a portion of the formula measuring based on measure of outcomes. And as I understand it, you're trying to sort through which of those outcomes are the right ones to measure and which of those outcomes are measurable. And I like the idea of having the multi ways of measuring, in part because when we think about equity goals, they don't necessarily look the same at Portland Community College as they do, out at Central Oregon or Klamath, or and the in communities where the population profile is where the service population is different, then you run the risk of measuring things that are not the things in that community that that we want community colleges or higher education to address, and making college making more accessible and affordable, and tied with the local economy. So these notions of academically challenged and the language issues and the economic issues, and maybe, I don't know where you're going to land, but I think you can, if I think I can fairly state that the general consensus that I've heard in our discussions is that we do want a process that's weighted to have be responsive to a set of outcomes, and so that's on the right track. And what you're seeking today is our best thinking about what your options are to incorporate into your model. Commissioner Heyman.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair Cross. I'm intrigued by the idea of at least focusing on the adult student learner, perhaps as a inroad to addressing this sort of equitable outcomes issue. Maybe you haven't thought about this, but if you focus on that population, how would the principles bleed into or be applied to the more traditional students who perhaps has similar educational challenges?
If I understand your question, you're asking, if we focus on adults, how does that also help the traditional age students, the less than 24-year-olds? Yeah. I think that's a great question. I'm sensitive to the point that I think Commissioner Devlin made a few minutes ago, whereas if you, in a formula with a fixed pie of funding, if you focus on certain populations of students within that, then you could be detracting from others, right? So I'm sensitive to that issue. What I can tell you is that when I looked at data last year, in terms of by age, you know, our population of community college students by age, what I noticed over the last decade is that the population of those students aged 24 and older has actually declined as a proportion of the total community college population. And the proportion of students who are, you know, under 24 has increased slightly. So I think that's partly a result of dual credit programs and other services, but I don't know that we would want to disincentivize, you know, if we would want to hurt the ability of our colleges to focus on those students. We don't want to make a trade-off here, right? We don't want to focus on adults to the exclusion of other students, right? So that would be an unintended consequence we would have to pay very close and careful attention to. But at the same time, you know, how do we nudge? How do we nudge in the right direction? And so I think there's a way to do that, right? If by finding a more effective way to direct resources, I suppose the magnitude of that direction is important, right? And so I think our focus then would be on that magnitude, you know, not make the magnitude so big that it detracts, but at the same time making it large enough to where it encourages and enables colleges to do more of the good work they're already doing. So there's a balance to be had there, and that's why, you know, in funding formula conversations, and the work group has made this suggestion repeatedly that they want to see going forward a commitment to revisiting this formula every 3 to 5 years. They've said 3 years. I kind of say 5 because I think every 5 years is probably good enough. But I think part of that recommendation, and that will likely be a recommendation that we present to you in February, because it has to be an ongoing conversation. The decisions we make today are the very best we can get our hands on with the data we have. And that does not mean 3 to 5 years from now, those decisions won't change based on changing circumstances, based on shifting priorities, different levels and magnitudes of resources available. And so this has to be an unfolding conversation. But I suppose at this point, I'm just rambling, but I think there's a balance to be made. And I think we can work with the work group on striking that balance.
Commissioner Hayman, if I might add on a very different level, not in contrast to what Jim said, but in addition, one of the things that we would do, and that came up indirectly, at least at the work group, would be to identify how returning adult learners are different from recent high school graduates, or youth who may not be recent high school graduates, actually. For example, one of the reasons that a single characteristic, using adult learners as the only way to weight a model, could be problematic would be that, you know, the racial ethnic identities of our adult learners are not at all representative of the racial ethnic identities of our youth. So just as an example, so that would be an additional thing above and beyond what Jim said, that we would be looking at different kinds of learners, and in particular, different ages of learners.
I just wanted to, I really appreciate both of your responses. I think I wasn't looking for a detailed answer at this moment, reflecting Chair Cross's emphasis on trying to keep the board at a more policy level. But I have heard in the conversation up until this point, sort of sensitivity to how focusing on one dimension or one group or one metric have a negative impact on another group. I just hadn't heard you bring that into the conversation when you focus on adult learners as a proxy for an overarching funding strategy. So I just at some point I think that's going to need to be sort of built into your thinking. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I'll quickly just add, that's why I think in reflecting upon that issue, especially over the last day and a half, my thinking is really kind of moved more toward the idea that we need multiple metrics and characteristics, right? We can't just have one, you know, we need 2 or 3. Is 3 enough? Is 5 too many? You know, that may be a different question, but there has to be a number of metrics that use and inform those choices. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
One of the things I wanted to check with you on is when we first started this conversation, there was at least a moderate amount of pushback on even considering a outcome driven system, and that's not a fair description because it's only partially outcome driven, but enough to shape, enough to carry policy from words to action and outcomes. Because I think that's the real reason for incorporating a formula that has outcomes. It's one thing to say something's important, quite different to put some dollars attached to that so that you're incentivizing it to happen. I guess my question is your sense that the work group is now at a place where they're working through those initial concerns that we heard about that approach, or should we anticipate more conversation about that direction as a good or solid policy direction to pursue?
yeah, I think you'll probably still hear some concern from some stakeholders about that design element. I want to further reflect on the report that came from Texas, because I think it's important. In the report, the researchers who wrote it, and I'm quoting here, they said there's a growing body of literature that has suggested students attending colleges with higher expenditures per student have both higher rates of college persistence and certificate or degree attainment and faster time to degree than colleges that spend less per student. So what we're finding in objective research, we're really finding that really at both the 2-year sector and the 4-year sector, the more you spend per student really does impact the efficiency and the outcomes of students. And so if that's the case, then the conversation around whether it's an inputs-based model or an outcomes-based model is not as important as, are you then directing more resources, you know, to account for the differing levels of support needed to provide students from different backgrounds the equal opportunity to succeed, right? And so I think I sometimes see it as, yes, this formula should have a component that is based on outcomes, you know, metrics, but I really think it's broader in that we should say it's really student success metrics, right?
Yeah.
Because we're trying to, I think, you know, again, to speak to Commissioner Hayman's point, you know, we're really trying to find a more effective way to direct the resources needed, especially to help underserved students accomplish their definition of success. Because of course, the community colleges, the definition of success is very, very different for different students, unlike the universities where graduation is often the success. And so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that with the work group, we can continue the conversation and develop consensus around this idea of, designing a formula that accomplishes what they've been able to in Texas, because the researchers there found, and to be fully transparent, they shifted their community college model back in 2010 to include a small component that's based on outcomes. Their outcomes are momentum points, which is, did you help the student maintain momentum toward did you help them become college ready? Did you help them become past the first 9 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours? Did you help them, get a certificate 1 year? Did you help them get a certificate 2 year? Did you help them become transfer ready to a 4 year? There's a whole slew of metrics that they consider as part of that outcomes component. It started out with only 10%, now it's at 12. And what you're hearing from the colleges in Texas, they actually think that component should be much larger, a much larger part of the formula, which is certainly not what they said 10 years ago. But the folks who conducted this study, they found that the current funding system in Texas does demonstrate that there's higher per student spending in community colleges, serving higher percentages of students older than 24, first generation college students, English learners, economically disadvantaged students. So that small slice, only 10% to outcomes over that past 10 years, has actually done exactly what they wanted, driving more resources to those colleges to help those underrepresented students, which is, I think, what we're all trying to do. So, but I think we're going to try to speak to that in terms of, can we create and focus on those student success, metrics that we're really trying to achieve, and aligning it to the adult attainment goal and others. So I'm hopeful we can get there. I'm hopeful that we'll have generated sufficient consensus around some of these ideas by February.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping, that we can come to February and have a clear picture of where we are going and feel good about that process. Not that it won't be without controversy, but that we will have a well thought out and defensible policy position to move forward with. So, any other questions on the funding formula? And if not, is there any other business to come before the committee today? Hearing none, I think I will declare us adjourned, and we'll see you all tomorrow for our full HECC commission meeting. So thank you for all your thoughtful presentations and questions, and appreciate being able to chair the meeting in Commissioner Rowe's stead. So see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.